All right, good evening. Thank you for joining us on this, what promises to be a very interesting live conversation. I'm Faye D'Souza. We've had the interim budget announcement that's come in today by the Finance Minister, Mr. Nirmala Sitharaman. Very, again, super interesting sort of announcements that she has made because. She spent basically the entire time talking about the achievements of the government over the last 10 years, the economic achievements of the government. Because in an interim budget, you can't really make any new announcements. It's meant to just basically close the accounts and get an approval on the accounts, and the real announcements actually come in about June or July after the new government is in place. Here are the reasons why I think it's interesting. There were no changes in tax benefits and things like that because you're not allowed to make those changes in an interim budget. Nirmala Sitharaman very confidently saying that in June, our government will announce new things. So there was sort of like a calm sort of confidence in this government that they are going to win the next election and they're going to come back and they're going to continue with their plans. Also, because unlike the last time when there was an election looming in 2019 and Modi government, the first term was sort of scrambling to make as many announcements as possible before the elections came up. This time, we didn't see that scrambling. It was sort of a calm, like, we know what, we've got this. We don't have to scramble. We don't have to make those announcements. We know what we're doing, sort of a thing. That was the sense that we got from the government. Now, because also Nirmala Sitharaman spent a lot of time talking about the achievements of the government over the last 10 years, what we're going to do is also review this entire last 10 years in terms of how the government has done. Now, right on the top of it, if you consider what a lot of citizens are saying, there are a couple of things that obviously have gone well in India over the last 10 years. Infrastructure, for example, we're constantly looking at new bridges, new highways, new airports, new ports, new bus stops, new train stations, new trains. There's a lot of talk about that. Now, there's also a lot of old infrastructure, like our old trains, and there's a lot of stuff that needs to be fixed. But it must be acknowledged that we're inaugurating new infrastructure on a daily basis, and a lot of it is world class and can compete with any country across the world, and that's definitely a plus. Um, the Indian economy, in comparison to some of its peers and some of the larger economies across the world, is growing much faster at about a ballpark of 6%, when the rest of the world is looking at 1% to 2%. Now, these are all good things. We're poised, according to the government, to become the number three economy fairly soon. What are the flip side bad things, if I were to list them out? Let's talk about inflation. There's a lot of talk about how the average Indian cannot afford the basic things they need to make ends meet or to run their homes. They're not making enough money. There's a serious problem of unemployment. You remember that story we talked about recently, where hundreds of thousands of young men lined up in Haryana to get jobs in Israel, and they didn't worry that much about their lives being in danger. They really needed the jobs, and that should tell us something. There is definitely a problem with unemployment. There's a problem with private sector investment as well. Remember, the startup sort of unicorn bubble is going a little bust right now, and that was where a lot of the investment was being attracted into, and that's got to slow down as well. So there's a problem of jobs, there's a problem of inflation, and there's a problem of investment, and fundamentally there's a problem of inequality. The rich have become richer, as numbers have told us, and the poor have not been able to participate in this growth that we're talking about. But let's take a look at what the economists have to say. I have fantastic guests joining us right now. After a really long time, Dr. Jayati Ghosh joins us. She's an economist who's currently professor at University of Massachusetts in Amherst in the US. She was also, she taught economics at JNU in Delhi for nearly 35 years. She's authored and edited 20 books and more than 200 articles, and it is a pleasure to have her here with us. Also, we have Professor Mritiunjoy Mohanty, who is a professor of economics at IIM Calcutta, joins us right now. He has a PhD in economics from JNU, New Delhi, and his areas of research are growth, employment, labor markets, and the economy and macroeconomics. So it's really good to have both of them here because they're experts in this area. I welcome the two of you. And also for our audience, We're opening this up to questions. So you can ask questions. The whole idea is to be able to understand, the economics of our country better. I will start with Dr. Jayati Ghosh. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. What is your review of the last 10 years of our government from an economic point of view?
Well, first of all, Faye, it's such a pleasure to be back in conversation with you. So thank you for having me. Yes, I have to say, when I looked at the finance minister's speech, I was absolutely struck at the number of completely false statements that were made with great confidence. I mean, really, I know that this is a government in which many ministers have no problem saying the exact opposite of the truth when it suits them. But to make claims that are so easily verifiable, it seems a bit bizarre. So, for example, she said, that in these 10 years, the average income, the per capita income has gone up by 50%. Their own data, the Ministry of Statistics data, is saying that between 2014 and 2023, it went up by 35%. But also we know, and that's absolutely critical, that this is very unequally distributed income. And so what is much more telling is what has happened to real wages. In fact, real wages have been stagnant through this period. That's a remarkable thing for an economy that, as you say, is growing by, on average, around 6%, 5 to 7%. To have real wages stagnant over this period, between 2014 and 2022, it's below 1% per year for all workers, only 0.3% per year for non-agricultural workers. For construction workers, it's come down. And of course, the big problem that you mentioned, the jobs problem. Ms. Sitharaman said that people are living better and earning better. That's simply not true, as we've seen. The real wages are falling, which is for a bunch of workers, or stagnant for average workers. Median wages are down. But employment is absolutely the biggest challenge, I believe, in the country today. It's not just the open unemployment, of course, which is very high. It's the fact that there are so many workers who don't even look for work because they know they won't get it. The discouraged worker effect, as it's called. Now, again, there was a blatant lie. The finance minister claimed that measures taken for the empowerment of women have led to increased participation of women in the workforce. But actually, the opposite is true. Women's participation in paid employment has declined from already abysmal rates of 14% for all women aged 15 plus in 2011-12 to 13% in 22-23. So how do you get this supposed big increase in workforce participation of women? By including the unpaid helpers in family enterprises. They get no payment for their work. Now, the ILO makes it very clear, employment is only work that gets some payment, including self-employment, some payment. And it's a subset of all work, which includes work done within the house, outside the house. But unpaid work is not employment. If you look at that, 37.5% of the women who are described as working in 22-23 were not paid anything. So they're not employed. And if you remove the unpaid workers from employment, only 30% of all the people of working age are in any form of paid employment, even the most fragile, terrible, low-paid jobs. Only 30%. I mean, it's unthinkable in an economy with a dominantly young population, with so many people of working age, that we are employing less than 1/3 of them. And this has actually got worse. I mean, we're not creating the conditions for more employment. The budget speech also said investment is buoyant, with entrepreneurship is on the rise, success stories, in other words. Again, investment during the tenure of the Modi government has been under 30%. It's been an average of 28.9%. In the previous UPA government of those 10 years, it was 33.4%. But what's also very telling, this investment rate throughout the Modi period has not risen above 30% in any 1 year. Meanwhile, in the UPA government, it did not fall below 30% in any 1 year. So, meanwhile, even this 28.9%, even the fact that it's risen a little bit in the last 3 years, is entirely due to public investment. Now, in fact, it's good to have public investment. I'm all for it. And as you mentioned, there are roads and airports and ports and all of that kind of thing. But it's very capital intensive. And there is very little public investment in the things that matter for the lives of people in very critical ways, in health, in education, in sanitation, and so on. So that's really why private investment has stagnated or declined. In fact, as a share of GDP, private investment has declined. So,
Yes.
it's not surprising.
So
Yeah.
Professor, but let me just break this down for our audience. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that there are a couple of serious problems. You're saying only 30% of those people who are young enough, who are in the working sort of age bracket, are actually working. The rest are all unemployed. And you're also saying that a lot of the investment that's coming in is coming in from the government itself. So government is building large infrastructure, and that's where the money is going, and that is creating jobs, but that's not enough, because we
It's
also
not
need
creating jobs, it's creating infrastructure.
to
It's
create.
very capital intensive. So, not much employment there.
But okay, so let me just ask you this now: from what you're, the picture that you're painting, vis-a-vis the picture that we normally encounter of the fact that people are feeling buoyant, they're feeling optimistic. India is sort of taking her place among the rest of the world as a leader. These two pictures don't match.
It's the way in which the government has managed to control the narrative in mainstream media and in social media. So that people who are badly off themselves, who can't find jobs, whose wages are stagnant or declining, et cetera, think that they are unfortunate or unlucky or, et cetera. But everyone else is doing well because it's painted that way. So they somehow don't put it together that their own situation is actually a much more widespread situation. It's no accident that the government refuses to do a consumption survey, because we would actually know how many poor people there are. It hasn't even done a census. We don't even actually know how many people there are in the country.
So, okay, let me bring in Professor Mohanty as well. Professor Mohanty, same question to you. I'm going to open with this, which is your review of the last 10 years of this government from an economic point of view.
Yeah, let me first say that I entirely agree with what Jayati just put out, and what's really unfortunate is that in controlling the narrative, they have removed all other earlier sources we have of constructing a narrative for ourselves. Like she said, census is not there, consumption surveys are not there, you're rigging labor force surveys and so on and so forth. And in its place, they are putting forward data which supports their narrative. So the two things that are happening: you don't allow the construction of a different narrative because you don't allow the data to come forward. And then the only data that is available then supports what the government is trying to say, right? So this controlling the narrative is very, very important, and this budget exercise was a part of that exercise. The chief economic advisor's finance minister report, which was the pre-budget thing, was another part of the same exercise. But let me come back to the issues of what has happened to the economy in the last 10 years. As I see it, the economy entered actually a slowdown somewhere around 2011, 2012. So before the NDA government comes in, the economy has entered a phase of slowdown. Right? Now, if I go from there to where we are now, right, it actually has been a decline in the nominal rate of growth of the economy, right? And it has serious periods of deflation, right? Now, which none of us talk about, right? In the way that demand is played out, we don't talk about any of that. But this government, all governments make mistakes. Some things work, some things don't work. But this government has fundamentally and structurally harmed the economy. Harmed. Which is to say, when you don't understand that this economy, the informal economy, is a very, very important part of the way the GDP works and functions, and the informal economy is not only important in terms of the output it creates, it's important in terms of the employment it creates. They have taken an axe to the informal economy. And this by policy choice. This by policy choice. So what's the narrative? The narrative is the way you're going to take India into the 21st century and make it developed is to formalize. You don't have the foggiest notion of how you formalize the economy. So what do? You kill the informal economy. How did you do it? You demonetized. And the brunt of demonetization was in that informal economy. Prior to this,
Professor Mohanty, forgive me. Now let me ask you.
May I finish, Faye? I'll come
Sorry.
back. Just one moment.
Yes.
Prior to this government coming, the growth of the formal economy and the growth of the informal economy happened together. Now that relationship has gone. Now, when the formal economy grows, the informal economy may or may not grow. And if the informal economy does not grow, employment does not grow. Period. Yes, Faye.
Okay, so you did talk about demonetization. You said destroying the informal economy. There was also COVID. During the last term of this government, there was COVID that dealt a very severe blow to the economies across the world. Now, the argument is that India has recovered from both of these things very well. India is now back at pre-COVID levels in terms of most of the indicators, and growing faster than most of the other countries across the world. How would you reconcile this point that that the government is making at this point, that we're stronger and overtaking most of the other economies?
Okay, so you preempted the second point. So the second thing that they did was the response to COVID. It's true. We have recovered in a way, but ours was the harshest response to COVID in terms of lockdown. And the meanest in terms of policy support, in terms of spending money, in terms of availing credit, this, that, the other. We gave lots of stuff. We gave the banks. But in terms of spending money, it was the meanest. But be that as it may, people will argue about this and that. There is one undeniable outcome today, which is one outcome of the COVID response was a K-shaped recovery. So when you take demonetization and the K-shaped recovery, then the fact that the rural economy is near dead is not a great puzzle. And everybody will agree that the rural economy is near dead. All right. So what's the K? The upward arm of the K is 100 million. All right. The downward arm of the K is 900 million. Now, if 100 million are doing well, and they're doing very well, it's been the best year for Mercedes. It's the best year for SUVs.
Yes.
Right? But for two-wheeler production has not recovered to pre-COVID levels.
In fact, it hasn't even recovered from pre-demonetization levels. So you're right.
There you go. And look, I mean, we are economists. You give us enough money, we'll say exactly what you want to hear. So when I teach my students, I say, please run away from economists, right? So never believe economists, never, right? But numbers, numbers. And those numbers are private producer numbers. They come, you look at those numbers. If two-wheeler output has not recovered, as Jayati pointed out, to pre-demonetization, but my SUV production has gone up. It is the best year for Mercedes. That's okay. Now, on this kind of growth, I'm doing 6.57%. But eventually, the fact that the scale which reflects a certain structural damage, means that the size of the market will grow only very slowly.
Hmm. Okay, so
You know?
if I may now, I do want to bring in a couple of questions that are coming in on our chat window. Venkat Raman's asking this question: the stock market, and this is a few questions. So there's the stock market. Now, going by how the stock market is doing, it does seem optimistic. It's going from strength to strength. It's viewing this government as a government of stability. It's viewing this government as a government that continues to sort of place foundations for strength within corporate India. Remember, we cut corporate taxes, and there's an interesting angle there as well that I'll come back to. But on the other hand, food inflation. Anybody who buys vegetables, which is everybody in this country, whether you're vegetarian or non-vegetarian, you still need tomatoes. Otherwise, you're not going to make any rasam. There's just the price of vegetables, the price of rice, the price of gas cylinders just is astronomical, over the last 5 years. Again, if there is this much pain on the ground, why are we not seeing more of it? And does the stock market suggest that corporate India is doing really well, Jayati Ghosh?
Yeah, large corporates are doing very well, and certain favored groups among the large corporates are doing even better. But, the stock market behavior has never really tracked real economic performance or real investment. So this is a classic example where the last 5 years, the stock market has zoomed out of, beyond the charts actually. And yet private investment, real private investment is not picking up. It's actually falling. So that's an indication that the stock market does its own thing. It's, after all, it is really, as Kane said, it's one of those beauty contests where you have to decide what everybody else will find the most beautiful. And if you can hype it up that everybody looks really beautiful in that lineup, then you're fine. You can just live off those capital gains. So it's really part of what Mritiun described as, that K shape. The K has got more disposable income than they ever imagined. And so some of that is also going into different kinds of financial investment.
If I were to ask you then about inequality and the fact that the poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer, we've seen a couple of reports about that, and the fact that the inequality in India is far more pronounced. You did talk about the fact that GDP, we're looking at an average GDP that's very strong, but again, that change is not being seen on the ground. This government seems to be fairly confident going into this next election that they're in a good place as far as employment, as far as they're looking after the poor, because the poor is what really matters during an election. Where is that confidence coming from, in your opinion, Jayati Ghosh?
I think it's remarkable ability, as I said before, to control the narrative. First of all, you persuade everybody that your own problem is just your own, and that everyone else is actually doing really well, because look, we're telling you over and over again that it's all booming and wonderful. Second, it is that you don't allow data to come out, exactly as Mritiun said. You don't have consumption surveys. You don't, I'm wondering now that everybody has revealed that the labor force surveys show real wage stagnation, how long we will even get labor force surveys anymore. We don't have the basic census, which would tell us how many people have decent housing, what kind of work they do, how many days of work they get. We don't have any of that kind of information. So you suppress all of that. Consumption surveys also have the huge advantage. That was what we based our inequality estimates on. Now we don't have that either. So they know. In other words, it's not that they actually believe what they're saying. They know that there's a problem. That's why they suppress all this data. But having done that, the ability to control the narrative and then to divert people, to say, listen, it's okay, you may not have a job, but you can take great pride in being a Hindu now. That kind of thing is really where the focus has shifted. Because I do believe that among themselves, they realize that the economy is not in good shape, no matter what they might put out for public consumption. I mean, if they do actually believe it, they would be much more confident in releasing data. Since they're not, it suggests that they also recognize there's a problem.
Well, let me ask you this. And if I'm not mistaken, while the government gave a massive cut in corporate taxes to corporate India in order for them to be able to grow better, Over the last 10 years, the share contribution of corporate tax to the total tax collection has gone down drastically. And indirect taxes has gone up via GST. In fact, just this morning we were writing a story about how January is the second highest GST collection ever. And high GST collections are seen as an indicator of a good economy. But I want to ask you this: does it also suggest that when we are counting high GST collection, which everybody has to pay, even the little child on the street who goes into the shop and buys the smallest packet of biscuit has paid GST on that biscuit, vis-a-vis corporate tax, which is actually coming down? So are we actually at this point taxing the poor more and letting the big corporate guys off the hook a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. There is just no question about it. As a share of income, the poor definitely pay more taxes than the rich, even as individuals. And of course, in the case of large corporations, they get away with lower tax rates than even smaller companies and the micro enterprises. So there is no question that our tax system is very regressive and is becoming more regressive. So yes, policy is adding to the inequality. And of course, there are two types of things. There's the redistribution part, which is what you've just mentioned, but there's also what people call the pre-distribution. What are the regulations or the freedoms you give certain types of companies? You allow them to make money hand over fist in different ways. You allow them to access land, mineral resources, different kinds of nature. You allow them to ride roughshod over labor, etc. That's all pre-distribution. That enables some categories to get much, much more wealth.
Well, let me just take this question then to Professor Mohanty. Professor Mohanty, the government has been complimented in managing the GST transition really well in the indirect tax system. Now, should we take that as a positive? The fact that GST collections have gone up, there was a massive transition that the government had to manage, which they did. They've also managed to get a lot of the informal economy onto the UPI, the beam payment system. And this is something that deserves a lot of credit, that even when someone goes out to buy the smallest thing over a push cart, they're using right now UPI to make that payment, which means a lot of those cash transactions have moved onto a slightly more trackable formal system. Is that something we can credit the government for?
For the UPI system, sure, we can. But do remember that the UPI was set up, is a product of the National Payments Corporation of India, which was set up in 2009. And truly, UPI has revolutionized payments in India. And this is one area in which India is streets ahead of anywhere. I mean, interbank transfers take you like 3-4 hours. In the United States, they still take you a day and stuff like that. In Canada, it takes 2 days and stuff like that. But let me say something else, which is related to GST. When I said this informal economy, right, and that they took an axe to the informal economy, guess who bore the burden of an implementation of GST which did not recognize that something called MSMEs exist? It's the MSMEs. So now I've formalized. How did I formalize? I pushed these chatties out. And why did I push it out? Because it's very onerous. It's very onerous to comply for a small unit. So what have you done? There's a new kind of job in financial services which is doing very well, which is people who help you fill out your GST form and so on and so forth. Right? That's a new kind of job. But Indians are very smart people. Very smart people. And any government that forgets their smart people at some point pays for it. So what was the response of corporate, mid-sized firms in corporate India to GST? Shell companies. So there's a whole proliferation of companies in which they have intercompany transaction, which then net off their GST payment. So now there's a whole division of the revenue department which is tasked with tracking these companies. Now, clearly there is a need to simplify taxation. But clearly also one has to see that there's always a trade-off. As big corporates will comply because for them it's a fixed cost. So small guys don't because they can't, not because they're cheats. They go down under. Right? So yes, it has. But what has it done to your overall tax GDP ratio? Right? 1 point increase, 1.5 point increase. That's it. So yeah, for sure. See, I think this government made up its mind that everything that had been on the anvil for 10 or 15 years, it was going to implement and say that, look, you guys couldn't do it, we guys did it. Now, when demonetization, which had been actively pursued by all shades of government, 3 times, thrice, somebody stepped back. Now, of course, it's possible that everybody else who looked at it were fools or politically incapable. Or maybe they knew something. And post facto, they knew something. Right? And the last bit, all this, and I'm not taking anything away from UPI. I think it's marvelous. Right? Just 2 days ago, the RBI came out with a statistic which was say that all the money that went out of the system, currency that went out of the system because they took out 2000 rupee notes, is back into the system. So there is this number, 12% of GDP. Now, India's currency in circulation hovers around that number, do what you will. Why? Indians love cash. But we are not alone in loving cash. The Japanese love cash. It's damn hard to go around in Japan, if you travel in Japan, and not have cash in your pocket. Right? Now, to make this as an indicator of being developed. Hello? To make this to say that, if you're using cash, you mustn't be paying tax. Hello? The guys who don't want to pay tax, who evade, actually don't hold cash. They do it. They're much smarter, nicer, neater ways of doing it. And Mauritius is just around the corner.
Okay. I have more questions for you. I'm going to try and work through as many questions as we can. One question comes in from one of our viewers. I'm sorry, I missed your name because the chat is moving really quickly. But a good question of, he said that corporate tax was reduced in order to attract more manufacturing jobs to India, large-scale manufacturing jobs. Have we managed to do that? And secondly, the question about infrastructure. If we're building large infrastructure, does this mean the focus is now shifting from rural agrarian farmers? And we also know that every time a large road is added, it changes lives for people there. It shortens their time it takes to travel to the market and back, which means farmers can get their produce to the mandi faster, cheaper. It saves them time. It saves them money. Is the change in infrastructure actually going to change lives on the ground? And are we going to have we been able to attract more manufacturing jobs by cutting that corporate tax? Jayati Ghosh.
No, unfortunately not. In fact, what Nirmala Sitharaman herself complained to a bunch of industrialists that I gave you all that benefit of reducing your tax rates and you didn't invest more. In fact, investment rates continued to fall after that 2% of GDP gift to large corporations. They simply took that money and relaxed. Why? Because of the market. Exactly as Mrityunjoy was saying, if there's no mass demand, they're not going to invest. So that's the basic issue there. But why are we not then generating manufacturing? Because, public investment does have a lot of positive impact on private investment. Everybody knows there's kind of crowding in. If you create infrastructure, there's demand for the ancillary activities, and then there's an easing of the supply conditions. I think the problem is this. Number one, it's the attack on the small and micro enterprises, the informal activity in general, as Mrityun has talked about. But number two is that these are mainly not the kind of infrastructure that really reaches out to previously underserved areas. It's more big ticket things. So, there are major connectors between big cities, there are expansions of ports, which are not unimportant. They're all good, but it's focused on the very, shall we say, the things that would be more evident to the elite and the middle class, and to big ticket things, high speed trains or snazzy new airports or the latest, container port kind of systems and that kind of thing, rather than exactly what you were saying, those roads, proper all-weather roads linking all villages. Some states have them, but those are state government driven. They are not central government driven in the same way. So that's one of the problems with the infrastructure thing. The NDA governments that we have had have always loved building. They're just very into construction. And whether it's a temple or a road or they just love building.
But isn't that a good thing? Isn't building a good thing?
Good thing if it is combined and if it's balanced. In other words, we are an economy with multiple needs. So you can't put all your eggs into the building basket, and certainly not into the building for the big, snazzy infrastructure only. So I think it's really a question of being able to combine those two. Definitely we need infrastructure, but we also need public services. We hugely underprovide public services. Totally, we spend only 1% of GDP on health. Center and states put together. When I tell colleagues anywhere else in the world, they cannot believe me. They think I'm making it up. In fact, at the moment, it's 0.9% of GDP that we spend. It's unbelievably low. We spend less than 3% on education. And, Bangladesh spends more than us, relatively speaking. Sri Lanka spends 3 times what we spend on these things. So we really have to be spending on those as much as on infrastructure. It's not good enough. And by the way, health, education, sanitation, these are all very employment intensive. They create jobs. And then those jobs create more jobs through the multiplier effect.
And also, Dr. Ghosh, we had the finance minister sort of put out her chart for the next 5 years as well. And she said, this is the kind of progress that we're going to look at on the next for the next 5 years. Now, it's ambitious, but a lot of the pundits would say that maybe this government is currently in a good place to assume that they'll come back for another term. What is your review of, the forward-looking projection of this government?
There isn't really a vision. There are all these slogans. So, we began with the slogan, Achhe Din Aenge. Then we got doubling farmers' income, which, have you noticed, nobody mentions that anymore. Then it was this completely vacuous thing about 5 trillion economy. I mean, yes, of course, at some point it's arithmetical. At some point we'll reach 5 trillion. Big deal, US dollars. And now it's become Viksit Bharat. So it's just a slogan. There isn't really a clear vision, and it's certainly not a vision that is all-encompassing for every person in the country. Mm-hmm. I think that's really the problem, that we've lost. And furthermore, I think there's another part of the vision that I really do object to. They claim that they have moved from entitlement to empowerment. I think it is tragic that we were in a space where finally we were recognizing rights-based development, the right to work, the right to food, the right to health, all of these things, right to information. These were citizens' rights that the government's duty was to provide. We've gone back, we've stepped back from all of that, and now it's all a gift of the Prime Minister. Anything that you get is a gift. You are a labharthi. It's not your right, it's not a haq. It is entirely a gift. So back to the old patron-client, Sarkar Mai Baap kind of vision, which is very, very unfortunate and regressive.
Well, we should talk about the direct benefit transfers the government has managed to do into people's bank accounts. But Sharon asks an overview of the budget and the key takeaways. Well, it was just really a closing of accounts and the government talking about, its last 5 years. There wasn't any big announcement that came out of this budget. But there was an interesting fiscal deficit number that, I would like to look at. Because, and that was really the first thing that the government announced, the fiscal deficit number was coming in at this point within target for 2024-25, estimated at 5.1% against the 5.8% the current fiscal year, and the current financial year. And this is within sort of what was estimated. The government wants to bring it down further, as it had talked about. But this is a good thing. We're managing to keep our fiscal deficit in control. So, Professor Mohanty, a couple of, if we were to, take a look at these things.
Sorry, I'm
Yes.
so sorry, Faye, and so sorry, Mrityun, but could I speak first because I actually have to leave in 2 minutes. So
Okay,
could I
okay, sure.
quickly respond,
Yeah,
and then I'm
please,
very
please,
sorry I would have
go
to
right
leave.
ahead.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I
No,
just want to mention all these fiscal deficit and other deficit numbers, the revenue and spending numbers are meaningless because they're based on only 9 months of the year. And the 3 months of the year that are still left, they can put in any number they like. And we know from past experience, the budget estimate, the revised estimate, the first round actual, and the final actual are completely different. So, they can give any number they want. They can claim, yes, we've kept it to 5.8%. Frankly, we have no idea what will happen. We do
Oh,
know that things like health and education and so on, the actual spending on it is way below the revised estimate typical in the last 3 years, and it's much below the budget estimate. So, they can do it in many different ways, but to rely on these numbers that were presented today as being a proper indication of what is happening this year, I think that's meaningless.
okay. Professor Jayati Ghosh, thank you so much for joining us. I do understand, appreciate that you
Yes,
need to
I'm
leave,
so
but
sorry. Apologies for leaving you.
I
Yeah.
really enjoyed
See you
chatting with
here.
you, and I do hope we can see more of you
Yeah.
on this show.
Yeah.
Taking the question to Professor Mohanty
bye, Jyoti.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
about
Yeah,
policy stability. Again, corporate India feeling that this government offers a certain level of stability when it comes to policy. They're able to plan their businesses better, and direct benefit transfers, because it's going directly into people's bank accounts. The leakage has been controlled, and I remember one economist of the government talking about how this sort of lends a certain dignity to people because they're not standing in line, at ration shops, and they're not standing in line in front of the local babus being treated badly. Money is coming directly into your accounts. Is this also something that you see as a positive that will, change the way the poor are treated in our country?
surely. You know, to reduce leakage is very important. Very, very important. I think it was Rajiv Gandhi who had pointed out for every rupee that the government spends on some scheme, barely 10 paisa enters into the person, goes to the person for whom the scheme is meant. That's huge kind of leakage. So we have been tackling this, been facing this problem, and when the government is able to bring that leakage down, hats off to them. Very good, right? However, there are 2 points I'd like to make.
Hmm.
If we provided decent employment
Okay.
with a living wage, I wouldn't have to worry so much about direct benefit transfers. It's a direct function of the abysmal performance in generating employment, which Jyoti spelled out so graphically, which means that I am now much more dependent on direct benefit transfers to say, all right, don't worry, you don't have a job, you have that. Now, again, when it's an entitlement, when it's what the word Jyoti used was, it's a hak, it's for everybody, then it's for everybody. Everybody should have food to eat. Everybody should have a roof to live. Everybody's children should be able to go to school. Now, to link that, rather than focus and say, let's see how we can generate more jobs. And the funny thing is, it's possible to do. It's possible to do.
So,
You focus, just a moment, let me just finish this. You focus on reviving the rural economy. You focus on rural non-farm economy. You focus on getting non-farm activities going, you'll get a whole different outcome. Both consumption and demand will change. But no, the downward slope of the K is what you're interested in. Sorry, you were saying something.
Yes, I have a question here from DK who says, "Don't we need to attract investments to create more jobs?" Are you guys fundamentally against corporates? Is that the whole in your argument? So yes, so if the government, has, which it already has done, DK, cut corporate tax quite drastically, provided a sort of stable environment for corporates, has that really, not resulted in creating jobs? And what needs to be done in order to facilitate that even further?
Faye, to say that one does not give credit is rather unfair, right? Now, you mentioned the stock market, which is doing so well, which has never done as well in the last 5 years, right? Why? Because corporate profits have done exceptionally well. Okay. Now, when your corporate profits are booming, right, and the government is spending in infrastructure, there's public investment happening. Why is private investment not happening? Now, it's a question, right? So if private investment is not happening, then I am unwilling to spend and sink money into creating new capacity, which will generate jobs alongside goods and services, because I'm unsure. Right? It's only when I'm sure that it will lead to my capacity utilization rising and getting, I'm not stuck with unutilized capacity, that I do it. So the fact that it's undoubtedly the case that corporate investment corporate taxes have come down, but has corporate investment gone up in the same way that you would expect? No. And this is what government's own data is saying. You don't take my word for it. No, not at all. So point is, there is only one engine of investment that's firing today, and that engine of investment is public investment. And again, as Jyoti pointed out, that public investment is of the kind that is not generating enough employment. Now, for example, one of the areas that the government has spent a lot of money in, and this Awas Yojana, they've built huge amount of houses, and again, that's a big plus, which means one of the sectors that is doing well in the economy on the supply side is actually construction. Now, normally when construction is doing well, it leads to employment generation. Why not? Why isn't it happening this time? Right? So I'm not saying I have these answers. I'm simply saying there is an issue in the way in which if demand is not vigorous, if demand growth is not vigorous, corporate investment steps back. In the government's figures this time, they've gone on and on about this and that. The economy is growing at 7%, and it's saying consumption is doing well. Now,
right.
Consumption, private final consumption growth is roughly 4%. And this is the lowest it has been since 2002-3. And again, the problem over here is urban consumption is actually doing well. Rural consumption is not. So that the rural economy is holding you back. You see,
Well, I
so
do want, I want to point out a couple of things, if I may.
yes, please.
HUL, which is India's largest sort of consumer goods, consumer products company, in its last results, it posted a 4% increase in sales, and volumes had increased 3% quarter to quarter. And there was an indication that three-fourths of the growth that it has seen was driven by demand increase rather than by price hikes. And so there was a sort of takeaway that, okay, so maybe demand is still increasing. But the question is it increasing in line with what we should be seeing ideally? So if people are getting jobs across the country, people are doing well, they'll buy more. Are we seeing that on the ground? Also, for those of our viewers who are asking about jobs, there is no other jobs data other than the data that comes from government. Now, the data that comes from government suggests that manufacturing jobs and services jobs are not going up right now. And given the fact that we want corporate India to, and FDI to increase, it should be showing an increase in these jobs specifically, which we have not seen. Professor Mohanty, go ahead. Is HUL sort of a proxy for the economy, and is a 3% uptick enough of a demand increase that we should be seeing at this point?
So, Faye, where FMCG is concerned, right? What you call HUL, Procter and Gamble, these we should use as very, very useful proxies. Not for the economy, but for the nature of demand. All right. Now that there is a 3% increase, 3% increase in demand, whether it's good or bad, you have to see that increase in demand in light of what was earlier. Right. Now, if demand had plateaued out and is increased by 3%, that's a plus. But in pre-COVID, if demand was rising at 7-8%, is now growing at 3%, then you know that we're not back to pre-COVID. More tellingly, look at what HUL is saying. HUL is saying in that report that demand increased, but prices didn't. Now, which it means that it is hesitating to increase prices of products because it's unsure about the ability of the consumer to absorb that price increase. So it's much rather allow the demand to rise, keep prices where they are, which means the margins will suffer. Right? So the robustness of FMCG, and that's the additional data point, just like two-wheelers. Every FMCG company is telling you rural demand has not recovered. Every FMCG company is telling you. Whereas urban demand has recovered. Right? And today, as it should be, right, the rural economy is a very, very big part of India's economy. Right? So there are certain kinds of sectors for whom the recovery of the rural economy is absolutely central to their doing well. Right? So if I'm going to get revenue growth and no margin growth, then no margin growth means my profit growth is going to get. Now, which means that when it comes to shareholder returns, that'll get us set back. And which means that my stock price will suffer.
So one last question before we completely run out of time. Capital expenditure, according to the government in this budget, has been hiked to 11%. It was a very interesting number. 11% hike up to 11.11 lakh crore rupees.
Yeah, that was a number. I wondered what the symbolism of that number was. I was hoping you'd be able to tell me, given everything is about symbols these days.
Yeah. So I don't know what the symbol is, but the capital expenditure for our audience, that's the expenditure that the government will spend on building infrastructure and all of the things that we were talking about. It's been increased by 11% to 11.11 lakh crore rupees. But isn't this a good thing that our government is and taking into consideration Jayati Ghosh's point that we should be spending on health and education instead? We're routing a lot of the money into bridges and infrastructure and airports. But even so, a higher capital expenditure is a good thing, right, Professor Mohanty?
Absolutely, undoubtedly. It's a plus, plus, plus. We desperately need infrastructure, and it should be distributed across the country, which again is an issue. Who gets how much of that pie, etc., etc., is a big thing. Which states get it, which states don't get it, and we don't want to go there in this program. But nonetheless, the point is an increase in infrastructure expenditure is a plus, plus, plus. But when Jayati is saying we should be spending on health, education, and so on and so forth, Jayati is not saying that you cut back on capex and give it to those sectors.
Yeah.
She is saying that over time, the percentage of GDP allocated to these sectors has to go up. So let me say one last thing. All this thing about China plus one, this, that, the other, and investment pouring in, all that you're hearing, which is the sound music which is backing the government. So when you look at how much FDI has switched out of China, and where has it gone? Right? It's gone to Vietnam. It's gone to Mexico. Some of it has come to India, but not a lot. So why is it, forget Mexico, Mexico is an OECD country and it's got an excellent location, so on and so forth. But why is it that FDI wants to go to Vietnam and not come to us? Or hesitates? Now remember that actually FDI flows have come down, not gone up. Now it hesitates because of the quality of our human resources, the quality of our infrastructure, the quality of our clusters. Now, Vietnam has spent on that. And this is what Jyoti was saying, that, you want to make India attractive to global capital. Invest in people. Invest in people alongside infrastructure. Right? When you do that, you've got a skilled workforce, which is saying, look, not only is our wages low, but it's a low wage of productively.
Sure. All right. Yeah. So, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Professor Mohanty, thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation with us and giving us your opinion on where you see the economy right now and what the future is in the areas we need to be focusing on. So, obviously, there is a great deal of investment, as a wrap for our audience, a great deal of investment in infrastructure. India is growing really fast in comparison to its peers. There is also, as we have seen, a lot of work that's been done in formalizing the economy. Another win is UPI. The kind of changes, the tangible changes that we're seeing around us. Pockets where we need to see improvement over the next 5 to 10 years, our investment in education, our investment in healthcare, so better hospitals, which is a big learning from COVID, which we haven't implemented yet. Also, the fact that we still have a problem with jobs, we still have a problem with inequality. The poor have not been able to participate in the kind of growth we're talking about. And we hope that that is something that gets looked at in the future. So thank you so much all for joining us. Leave us questions and we'll try and bring you more and more voices and faces who can answer those questions on this channel. Thank you for watching.